Emily wakes up after 5 years of coma. As soon as she saw Julia, her mother, her expression suddenly changed into one of terror and confusion. Without warning, Emily, in a weak but panicked voice, screamed, get out of here, I don't want you here!" Her desperate cry echoed through the room, leaving Julia and David frozen in shock. What happened to their family? David and Julia were a couple who seemed to glow with happiness from the moment they met. Everyone could tell they were meant to be together because their love was obvious in every smile, touch, and glance they shared. As time passed, their joy grew, especially when their daughter Emily was born. Emily became their whole world, her sparkling eyes and infectious laughter lighting up every corner of the house. She was a healthy, active 6-year-old, always running around the yard and getting into the typical trouble kids her age do. But the peace in their home began to disappear when Emily started complaining of severe, constant headaches. At first, David and Julia thought it might be something minor. "She's probably just tired," Julia would say, trying to reassure David, who was growing more and more concerned. But the headaches didn't stop, and soon Emily's sleepless nights became unbearable. The little girl who used to sleep soundly was now tossing and turning, crying out in pain. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's condition got worse. She became exhausted, barely able to play or even talk. The laughter that once filled the house had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. David and Julia tried to stay calm, but their worry was almost too much to bear. They decided to take her to the doctor, but the first visit didn't give them any answers. "It might just be a viral infection," the pediatrician said, prescribing some medicine and recommending rest. The next few weeks were even harder, as didn't get better. In fact, she got worse. The headaches became more intense, and she grew weaker by the day. Her sleepless nights piled up, and soon she wasn't able to do the simplest things. Desperate, David and Julia sought out a specialist, even though the costs were more than they could afford. It wasn't long before they got the heartbreaking diagnosis, encephalitis. The word hit them like a ton of bricks. The doctor explained that encephalitis is inflammation of the brain, usually caused by an infection or an autoimmune reaction. It was a serious condition that would require intense treatment, and while recovery was possible, the chances were slim. David and Julia felt their whole world collapse. The first stage of treatment showed some promise, but as time passed, Emily's condition didn't improve. The once lively little girl lost her ability to move, and every action became harder and harder until she finally slipped into a coma. Their nightmare deepened. The hospital became their second home, a place where they fought daily against despair and uncertainty. The sterile, cold environment was a harsh contrast to the warm, joyful life they had before Emily's illness. Through it all, David and Julia remained united by their shared pain and hope. They spent countless hours by Emily's bedside, trying to hold on to some glimmer of hope amid the chaos that had taken over their lives. Each day felt endless, and the hope that Emily would one day wake up and return to the vibrant child she once was grew dimmer with time. The simple, happy life they once knew was now filled with deep sadness and a relentless fight for their daughter's survival. Time dragged on, and the harsh reality of Emily's vegetative state settled in. She lay still in her hospital bed, showing no signs of consciousness. David and Julia's hearts broke a little more each day as they faced the painful truth. The ongoing struggle to help their daughter seemed to be going nowhere, and the frustration of not being able to do more weighed heavily on them. Julia, once the pillar of strength and warmth, began to crumble in ways David had never imagined. Sleepless nights and constant worry pushed her to the edge, both physically and emotionally. She could barely get out of bed, her body weighed down by fatigue. The sparkle in her eyes, once so full of life, had faded into a distant, hollow gaze. One day, as she sat at Emily's bedside, her head hanging low and shoulders slumped, she said, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I don't know how to keep going." Her voice heavy with despair, her eyes swollen from tears. David, desperate to soothe her pain, tried to offer words of encouragement. "I know it's hard, Julia. I feel it too. But we have to keep fighting. Emily still needs us." But his words didn't seem to reach her. She was wrapped in her grief, unable to break free. Things that once brought her joy, like painting and tending to the garden, no longer mattered. Her health quickly deteriorated. She lost a lot of weight, and her energy was completely drained. She was a shadow of the vibrant woman she once was. David, meanwhile, tried to hold on to hope. He spent hours researching new treatments, talking to doctors, chasing down every possible lead for a miracle. Meetings with specialists and trying experimental therapies became part of his everyday routine, but nothing worked. Each time he heard the same response: "We're doing everything we can, but the situation is serious." With every failed attempt, a piece of his hope died. He watched Julia slip away, powerless to stop the heartbreaking reality that was crashing down on their family. The once unbreakable bond between them grew weaker with each passing day, as disappointment and a lack of communication pushed them further apart. Their days in the hospital felt never-ending. The room where Emily lay was filled with machines and monitors, constant reminders of her fragile condition. The cold, sterile environment of the hospital only made things worse, a painful contrast to the warm, happy memories of home, where Emily used to laugh and play. Hope felt out of reach, almost like a luxury they could no longer afford. David and Julia were trapped in an endless cycle of pain and waiting, struggling to find meaning in the overwhelming despair. Despite everything, they stayed by Emily's side, holding on to the faint hope that one day she might wake up and bring back the joy that had been lost. Months passed, and the hospital became their second home. No treatment seemed to make a difference, and Emily's condition remained unchanged. Then, on a grey day in September, a doctor called them into a small office for a private conversation. They sat down, hands shaking, knowing the news would be hard to hear. "David, Julia," the doctor began in a somber tone, "after reviewing Emily's case in detail and considering her lack of response to the treatments, we've reached a very difficult conclusion. According to the results of the tests and how the disease was progressing, it was highly likely that Emily would remain in a coma for the rest of her life." These words hit her parents like a ton of bricks. Julia collapsed into the chair, tears filling her eyes, unable to say a word. David, though clearly shaken, tried his best to take it all in calmly, even though his face had gone pale and his lips were tightly pressed together. The doctor went on, "I know this is devastating, but at this point, the best option is to bring Emily home. There's always a small chance for a miracle. At home, she'd be in a more comfortable environment, and you'd be closer to her. There's really not much more we can do here." When the doctor finished, the thought of bringing Emily home in such a fragile condition seemed nearly impossible to grasp. Still, the idea of keeping her in the hospital with no hope of improvement felt unbearable. David and Julia were overwhelmed with helplessness, struggling to accept a reality so far from what they had ever imagined for their daughter. The house, once filled with their happiest memories, now had to be transformed to accommodate Emily's needs. David and Julia spent weeks organizing everything, making sure the house had all the necessary equipment and creating a space that could give Emily some comfort. When the day finally came to bring her home, the atmosphere was heavy and somber. They took care of every detail with love, but the weight of their pain and despair was undeniable. Julia, doing her best to hold herself together emotionally, was dedicated to caring for Emily, though her own health and well-being were suffering. Meanwhile, David continued searching for any new treatment or sign of improvement, but as the months dragged on, nothing changed. The house, now filled with medical equipment, was a far cry from the lively, joyful place it used to be. Life for David and Julia became a painful routine, marked by a constant struggle to find some sense of peace amidst the suffering. The hope for a miracle became the only thing they could cling to as they faced the harsh reality of caring for their daughter, all while holding on to what felt like a distant dream of her recovery. 5 years had passed since Emily was brought home, and life had changed in ways that neither David nor Julia could have ever anticipated. Emily, now 12, was still in a coma, and any hope of her waking up seemed more remote with each passing day. The void her condition left behind touched not just her, but also David and Julia, whose lives had been irrevocably altered. Julia, once full of life and warmth, had become a shadow of her former self. The strain of the situation began to wear her down. "We can't keep going like this," Julia shouted one night, her voice echoing through the empty house. David, sitting by Emily's bedside, looked up in frustration. "Nothing is changing, David. This is hopeless. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Exhausted, David tried to stay calm. "I understand how you feel, Julia. I'm struggling too, but our daughter is still here. I have to believe that there's some chance, no matter how small." Julia shook her head, disbelief in her eyes. "Don't you see how this is tearing us apart? I can hardly even look at Emily anymore. She's a constant reminder of everything we've lost and everything we can't get back." The arguments between them became more frequent. The conversations, once filled with love and understanding, had turned into bitter disagreements and accusations. Julia found herself feeling a growing resentment toward her own daughter, a feeling that consumed her and left her drowning in guilt and shame. Seeing Emily, lying there motionless, was a painful reminder of the suffering her family had endured. Still, David continued to care for Emily with a level of dedication that seemed almost heroic. He always holding on to the hope that one day, somehow, a miracle might happen. He spent hours talking to her, reading to her, and creating an environment that he believed was as comforting as possible. But the emotional toll of watching Julia drift away from him and the ever-growing distance between them weighed heavily on his heart. Now, Julia and David were slowly drifting apart, caught in a bitter coexistence where communication became nearly impossible, and understanding felt out of reach. Julia withdrew more and more, spending hours sitting alone, lost in her own dark thoughts. She found no joy in the activities that once brought her happiness, like gardening or painting. The feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle of suffering was suffocating. David, on the other hand, tried to keep hope alive, but it became harder with each passing day. It felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, trying to keep Emily alive while also holding on to the last threads of his relationship with Julia. The love and devotion he had for Emily were the only things keeping him going, even as everything else around him seemed to be falling apart. As the days went by, Julia felt the emotional weight growing heavier. Her mind was often overwhelmed with feelings of unfairness and hopelessness. She no longer saw Emily's illness as a tragedy to endure, but as a cruel curse that had shattered every hope and dream she once had. One cloudy afternoon, when the house seemed unusually quiet, Julia was hit with an intense wave of frustration. The weight of her daily responsibilities, the constant fights with David, and the endless reminder of Emily's condition had finally reached a breaking point. Without thinking about the consequences, she went to Emily's room, which now felt like a shrine of sorrow and despair. With tears streaming down her face, Julia stepped inside and approached the bed where her daughter lay. The room was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment. Julia stared at her daughter, and with a trembling voice filled with pain, she whispered, "Emily, why are you doing this to us?" Her voice cracked as tears flowed freely. "It's been 5 years, 5 long years that you've been here without waking up. We're suffering so much and I can't bear it anymore. If you cared, you'd wake up and end this misery. I can't take it, please. Wake up and stop making us suffer." Julia's words, raw with pain and frustration, echoed in the room. She was too caught up in her own agony to realize the impact of what she had just said. The oppressive silence seemed even heavier after her outburst. Julia stepped away from the bed, retreating to her own room, unable to handle the weight of her own words. Guilt and shame began to crash over her like waves, and she sank into her bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her shoulders shook as the tears kept coming, the regret overwhelming her. She felt like she had crossed a line she could never take back, and the thought that she had, even unintentionally, hurt her daughter was unbearable. The house was eerily quiet, but Julia's sobs echoed through the halls. Guilt consumed her, leaving her feeling completely lost, unable to forgive herself for what she had said. The distance between him and Julia only seemed to grow wider, while she drowned in her guilt, and struggled to find a way to cope with the pain she had caused and the tragic situation they were living in. Julia's emotions continued to build, becoming an unbearable burden. The life that once seemed full of promise now felt like a never-ending battle, defined by her inability to cope with Emily's condition and David's growing detachment. The day-to-day routine, mired in suffering and stagnation, was suffocating, crushing what little desire she had left for change. She began to feel trapped, suffocated by her own home, which had turned into a prison she couldn't escape. One night, in a moment of absolute desperation, she made an impulsive choice. While David was busy caring for Emily, Julia packed a small suitcase filled with clothes and, consumed by despair, she left the house without a word, hoping to escape the relentless pain. But her plan didn't go far. David, who had noticed the sadness growing in her and her sudden disappearance, found her waiting at the bus stop before she could leave town. Concern was etched on his face as he approached her, a mixture of relief and anxiety in his voice. "Julia, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling with worry. "You can't just run away like this. We need help." Julia, with tears streaming down her face and her heart racing, looked at David, feeling both guilty and frustrated. "I can't do this anymore, David. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Realizing the seriousness of the situation, David knew he couldn't let Julia face this alone. After taking her home, he quickly decided it was time to get professional help. His main priority was making sure Julia received the psychological support she desperately needed to deal with her emotional struggles. With the help of a close friend, he arranged for her to be admitted to a mental health facility. The move to the hospital was tough for Julia. She felt embarrassed and defeated, but even so, the hospital provided her with a sense of safety and comfort that she hadn't felt at home. David visited her often, offering unwavering support and encouragement. Throughout the treatment, his commitment to standing by Julia's side was crucial for her recovery. He motivated her to get involved in the activities suggested by her therapists and stayed engaged in the whole process of healing. Gradually, Julia began to improve. The therapy sessions helped her manage her emotions and regain her mental balance. She started viewing her situation differently and developed coping strategies for stress and frustration. After 3 weeks, going back home was a significant step in her recovery. Julia began to re-engage in activities that once brought her joy, like reading, gardening, and reconnecting with old friends. Her progress was noticeable, and her relationship with David started to strengthen. They found a new rhythm in their lives, grounded in understanding and mutual support. Even though Emily's situation was still a challenge, Julia felt more prepared to tackle it, and the family grew closer once again. Julia's recovery wasn't instant, but with David's constant support and effective therapy, she found a renewed sense of hope. Day by day, she rebuilt her life, facing reality with greater resilience. After a period of intense psychological care, both Julia and David were ready to start a new chapter in their lives. The journey had been tough, but Julia found her balance again and a fresh sense of purpose. With David's ongoing support and her dedication to therapy, Julia was able to return to the workforce. She landed a new job at a community support organization, where her life experiences and the empathy she had developed over the years proved invaluable. Julia poured herself into her work with a renewed passion, finding fulfillment in helping others. This new job also had a positive effect on her home life. With the responsibility of caring for Emily still looming, the couple decided to seek additional help. That's when they decided to hire a nanny to help with Emily's care and lighten their load. Megan, a long-time family friend, was the obvious choice. She had always been a constant presence in their lives, known for her warmth and attention to detail. Megan quickly settled into her role as Emily's caregiver. Her presence brought a fresh energy to the household, always with a cheerful smile and a caring attitude. Megan became a vital part of the family. Megan treated Emily with such attention and care that it showed her deep respect and affection for the family, which helped create a more positive and welcoming environment. This new sense of balance allowed David and Julia to spend more time together, rediscovering the joy of each other's company. Evenings were now filled with lighter conversations and moments of connection that they had lost during the years of hardship. They found new hobbies and shared interests, and their relationship began to blossom again, and more understanding than before. Despite the improvements in their lives, the hope that Emily would one day wake up never faded. Every day was a chance to dream of a future where their family would be whole again. Megan's presence helped keep that hope alive. Julia continued to grow in her career and family life, using her experiences to make a positive impact on others. David, on his end, stayed strong, facing the day-to-day challenges with love and dedication, always holding on to the hope of a brighter future. The house, now filled with Julia's renewed energy, became a place where the pain of the past was still acknowledged, but where love and hope also had room to grow. Though their life was still marked by uncertainty, David and Julia had reached a new stage of support and resilience, and the promise of a fresh start felt more real than ever. A few months after Megan began working with the family, their routine stabilized, even though the hope for a miracle with Emily remained a distant dream. One afternoon, as Megan was cleaning Emily's room, she heard a faint, almost unnoticeable sound. At first, the noise was so soft it seemed like a random creak, or the wind slipping through a crack. With her heart racing from the weight of responsibility, Megan paused to listen more carefully. The sound seemed like a slight murmur, something that didn't come from any of the machines around her. Furrowing her brow, she moved closer to Emily's bed. It was then, as she leaned in, that she realized the noise was coming from Emily herself. A chill ran through Megan as she realized Emily was trying to make a sound. Panicked, she grabbed her phone and quickly called David and Julia, who were out shopping at the supermarket. The urgency in Megan's voice was all it took for David and Julia to drop everything and rush home. The drive back was a whirlwind of emotions. David kept his eyes glued to the road, while Julia, heart pounding, silently prayed. As they neared home, the streets seemed like a maze of emotions, where fear and hope collided in an almost unbearable way. When they finally got to Emily's room, the sight that greeted them made time stand still. Emily was lying there, her eyes partially open. Tears streamed down Julia's face as she approached her daughter's bed. Her emotions were overwhelming. Shaking from the intensity of the moment, she leaned in closer to Emily. Emily, with great effort, briefly opened her eyes and looked right at her mother. It was a fleeting, weak glance, but for Julia and David, it was the most precious sign of hope. With this small but meaningful response, David immediately grabbed his phone and called for an ambulance, urgently requesting help. Emily was carefully transported to the hospital with her family right by her side, their hearts heavy with hope and fear. At the hospital, the medical team quickly began a new round of treatments. Emily was given IV medications and placed under intensive care. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, acknowledging that while there was potential for recovery, the future was still uncertain. Even though they were exhausted and on edge, David and Julia stayed by Emily's side, clinging to hope with each little sign of progress. The wait was filled with anxiety, but also a renewed sense of faith in a better future. The news of Emily's slight awakening brought the family a glimmer of relief after years of living with constant despair. Emily's recovery, though still uncertain, sparked a wave of optimism for David and Julia, who were finally starting to see the possibility of a new chapter in their lives. Weeks of intensive treatment and specialized care passed, and slowly but surely, Emily began to show small but significant signs of improvement. Her recovery was painfully slow, but there was a major breakthrough. Emily started to regain her ability to speak. Though the words came with effort, they marked a huge step forward, something that hadn't seemed possible for years. The day Emily spoke again was one of the most emotional moments for David and Julia since their long journey began. Julia, a mix of hope and nervousness running through her, prepared to see her daughter, imagining that it would be a moment of deep connection and joy. When Julia entered Emily's room, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. Emily lay in bed, more alert than she had been in previous days. Julia approached slowly, a tense smile on her face, tears welling up, waiting for the moment her daughter would speak and show some sign of recognition and love. But what happened next was something no one expected. As soon as Emily saw Julia, her expression suddenly changed into one of terror and confusion. Without warning, Emily, in a weak but panicked voice, screamed, "Get out! Get out of here! I don't want you here!" Her desperate cry echoed through the room, leaving Julia and David frozen in shock. Julia's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of deep hurt and confusion. David, deeply shaken by their daughter's outburst, quickly stepped in to shield Julia from the emotional blow. He led her out of the room, trying to calm her down and make sense of what had just happened. David tried to comfort her, but Emily's rejection had struck a devastating blow. The pain Julia felt from being rejected by her own daughter was almost too much to bear. Meanwhile, Emily's doctor entered the room, trying to make sense of her agitated behavior. The medical team began reassessing the situation, considering whether something psychological or emotional might be behind Emily's reaction. Another doctor met with Julia and David, gathering information to see if anything in Emily's recent history might explain the sudden outburst. David tried to stay calm, but it was clear he was feeling both scared and frustrated. He struggled to make sense of the situation and figure out how he could support his wife and daughter through this crisis. Waiting for the diagnosis and the medical team's feedback was nerve-wracking. Doubts hung in the air as Julia and David waited, each coping in their own way, but both heavily affected by the complexity of Emily's recovery. Hours after Julia's emotional outburst with Emily, the doctor managed to get some time alone with Emily during a calmer moment. The medical team, worried about Emily's agitated behavior and unusual reactions, took a more direct approach to figure out what was causing such a deep emotional disconnect. The doctor found Emily more composed, a bit more aware of her surroundings, and open to expressing her feelings. With patience and empathy, he gently tried to explore Emily's thoughts and emotions, looking for clues about the source of her hostility towards Julia. What Emily revealed was shocking and heart-wrenching, changing the course of her recovery and the family dynamic. "I was aware of everything while I was in a coma. I heard every word they said about me," Emily began, her voice weak but clear enough for the doctor to understand. Her words were filled with years of bottled-up pain. "I knew what was happening around me, and I felt my mother's anger and disgust." The doctor was stunned, left in a moment of silence, his eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Julia, who had been waiting anxiously, was called into the office when the doctor felt it was the right time. Her face turned pale with terror and despair as she heard what Emily had shared. "Oh my God! Julia tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her body shook, and her eyes filled with tears as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the situation. The pain and regret she felt were visible, and she could barely handle the overwhelming guilt. David stood by her side, his face showing a blend of sadness and shock. Emily's revelation hit him hard, leaving him torn between comforting Julia and trying to make sense of what had happened with their daughter. Emily's words were both a cry for help and a direct accusation against her mother. Julia collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, her body trembling as she struggled to breathe. I didn't know she could hear everything," she whispered through tears. "I never wanted her to suffer. I was just lost, drowning in my own pain." The doctor took a moment before responding, trying to calm the situation. Emily's perception may have been influenced by many factors. The mind can process experiences in unpredictable ways, especially during a coma. What matters most now is focusing on Emily's recovery and rebuilding the family's bond. His words offered a new perspective, forcing Julia and David to confront the reality that their emotions and actions during Emily's coma had a far deeper impact than they ever realized. Julia's guilt was clear, and she understood that her struggle wasn't just about reconnecting with Emily, but also facing the weight of her own mistakes. Over the next few days, Julia was consumed by guilt. Her desperation to make amends led her to take a heartfelt approach. Every day she wrote a letter to Emily, each one simple, handwritten, containing just one word: sorry. Tears streamed down her face as she penned the letters, her heart heavy with regret. David carefully placed the letters in Emily's room, hoping she would sense Julia's sincerity and love. Though Emily refused to see her mother, Julia kept up her nightly ritual, sitting at the table to reflect and write. The act of writing became a moment of self-reflection, a way for Julia to revisit the words and actions that had brought them to this point. Each letter was a mix of pain and hope, a constant effort to find a path toward healing. During this time, David remained by Julia's side, offering his unwavering support. He also knew the importance of apologizing and prepared for the day when Julia and Emily could meet again. He believed that honesty and clarity would be key in explaining everything to Emily. 2 weeks later, that day finally came. Julia stood outside Emily's hospital room, ready to ask for forgiveness in person. The tension in the air was undeniable. After weeks of anticipation, Julia finally stepped into Emily's room, feeling the weight of the moment. Emily lay in bed, her expression distant, reflecting the pain she still held inside. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside in the hallway. Taking a deep breath, Julia pushed open the door. The air was thick with fear and hope, and she felt a lump rise in her throat as she neared her daughter's bed. With shaky hands and tears brimming in her eyes, Julia finally stood beside Emily. "Emily," she began, her voice heavy with emotion, "I want you to know how sorry I am. I never wanted you to feel this way. I was lost, confused, and I let that affect how I spoke and acted. I'm deeply sorry for the hurt I caused." David squeezed Julia's hand, silently offering his support. "What your mum said and did, it doesn't reflect how much we love you," he added gently. "We were both struggling with our own pain and didn't fully grasp how much our actions affected you. We're here now to say sorry and to promise you that we'll do everything we can to make things right." Emily listened quietly, her eyes betraying the flood of emotions inside her. The room fell into a heavy silence, and Julia's apology hung in the air. The honesty in her voice had clearly touched Emily, who was processing everything in real time. David spoke again, his voice steady and calm. "Emily, I need you to know that no matter what, I've always been here for you. Your mum and I. We've gone through some tough times, but we never stopped loving you. Now we're ready to rebuild what's been broken and do whatever it takes to support you." Emily's reaction came slowly, but it was there. Her face softened, and a vulnerable look crossed her eyes. Tears welled up as she whispered, her voice fragile but sincere, "Mum, I forgive you." Those words were like a wave of relief for Julia. Tears streamed down her face as her voice cracked. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means the world to me. I love you, and I truly am sorry." Emily continued, her voice still faint but filled with raw emotion. "I know it wasn't easy for you either. I'm grateful for everything you've done, even when things were hard. I know you were fighting your own battles." Julia, now calmer, reached out and gently took Emily's hand. "We'll face this together," she said softly, her voice laced with hope. "We'll all give it our best. Thank you for giving me this chance." Emily's forgiveness was a turning point. It brought a huge sense of relief, not only to Julia and David, but to Emily herself. In those few minutes, the mood in the room shifted from heavy and tense to lighter and more hopeful. Though there was still a long road ahead, Emily's forgiveness marked an important step. Weeks later, Emily's discharge from the hospital became a milestone for the entire family, though she was still confined to a wheelchair and unable to walk. New challenges awaited them, but they were ready to face them together with a renewed sense of strength and unity. Getting the house ready for Emily's return was the first priority. They made sure everything was accessible and comfortable, rearranging the furniture and creating a space that would support her rehabilitation. Megan continued to provide care and support, helping Julia and David manage the emotional and practical challenges they faced. Every detail was carefully considered to ensure a smooth transition for Emily. The visits from doctors brought both relief and new challenges. They were hopeful about Emily's progress, reassuring the family that with dedication and patience, her physical recovery would improve. She's stable, and with enough time and rehab, there's a good chance she'll regain her mobility. Julia and David, who had endured so much already, found new strength in the hope of seeing their daughter improve. Conversations became more open, and shared moments were cherished. Although Emily's recovery was slow, each small step was a sign of progress, and the family celebrated every little victory with joy. Even through sleepless nights and daily hurdles, Julia and David found happiness in the small milestones, her first foot movement, a spoken word, a look of recognition. Each step was a testament to Emily's resilience and her parents' love. As the months passed, afternoons filled with therapy sessions and specially adapted activities for Emily, while the nights gave Julia and David time to rest and reflect. Emily's gradual improvement renewed the hope in their household, strengthening the bonds that had been strained. This wasn't just physical healing, it was emotional too. Every day, though challenging, offered an opportunity for the family to rebuild and grow closer. Though the road ahead was still long, Emily's progress was a clear sign that, with hope, support, and unconditional love, the family was beginning to overcome the hardships and look toward a brighter future. The home, once full of sadness, now had a renewed energy of optimism. After a few months, Emily's life began to find some stability. Her recovery journey was long and full of obstacles, but Julia and David's devotion made all the difference. With a routine packed with physical therapy and rehab exercises, Emily's life became more intense by the day. David and Julia were always by her side during each therapy session, giving her words of encouragement and cheering her on with every small step she took. The joy on their faces was clear every time Emily managed to take one more step or showed even the slightest improvement in her mobility. Once Emily started walking again, Julia and David's relationship changed too. They learned to handle challenges together, seeing things from a new angle of patience and understanding. The love they had rebuilt became their source of strength, helping them navigate the highs and lows of Emily's recovery. Meanwhile, Emily began adjusting to her new reality, showing an incredible inner strength as she pushed through the long process of rehab until she finally regained her ability to move. Life wasn't perfect, but the family had found new hope and a sense of purpose. The road they had walked together had left its mark, but it also brought them closer and made their bond stronger. Emily's recovery and the changes in their family were proof that, even in the hardest challenges, love and determination can lead to a brighter, more fulfilling future. The painful journey had taught them the value of unconditional love, patience, and standing by one another. Each of them had come to understand that being a family means supporting each other in tough times and celebrating the small victories that make life meaningful. Julia, David, and Emily's story became an inspiring example of how, even after the darkest storms, hope and unity can still shine through. Their journey reminds us that, no matter the obstacles, it's possible to find happiness again and rebuild harmony through understanding, love, and forgiveness. With open hearts and newfound strength, they were ready to face whatever came their way, confident that, together, they could get through anything.